An Ordinary Battalion at War, the story of the 2nd Battalion Essex Regiment during the Great War. Episode 9, The First Gas Attacks. We had left the 2nd Battalion Essex Regiment at the tail end of April 1915 in trenches just to the south of Plug Street Wood, right on the border between Belgium and France. This is an area that they'd held over the winter of 1914 into 1915. That's pretty much where they'd found themselves at the end of the fighting known as the First Battle of Ypres in 1914. In late April, they're going to be pulled out of the line from this position and find themselves moving to the north to become involved in the battle known as Second Ypres. Now, in late April 1915, 22nd of April to be precise, the Germans use poison gas on the Western Front for the first time. The attack is in the north-northeast sector, in relation to the Ypres town of Ypres, and it falls upon French troops and Canadian troops and is massively disruptive. The troops aren't ready for the gas attack. Many of the French troops fall back. Some Canadian troops are able to hold the line, but the stabilisation that's required to keep the line in place requires the putting up of just different units pushed in all over the place. Something that's kind of I find quite interesting is the idea that if the first gas attack is on the 22nd of April, by the early days of May 1915, the British soldiers are receiving some very rudimentary gas masks, as seen in this image here from the Imperial War Museum. Now, Lieutenant Noel Irwin, that we've met a few times, wrote about this aspect of the war. This is from his book. We had, of course, no sort of protection against gas, but the battalion's medical officer hastily improvised simple gags of cotton wool and gauze, which at least gave us some confidence, even if they were really quite ineffective. The next model of gas mask, the first official one in fact, consisted of a pad of cotton waste impregnated with something which was apparently made more effective by the unattractive expedient of dampening it with urine. It was a fortunate biological fact that the desire, owing to fear, usually synchronised with the gas attack, the threat of the immediate danger overcoming any fear of squeamishness in adopting the measure advocated. Thus equipped, we advanced towards the supposed front line, which was believed to be held by Indian troops. And so this image on the screen now is actually those first issue ones, and Owen is talking much more about some improvised masks that they had before. So the position that they're moving into is on the north-northeast of the city of Ypres, as we already mentioned. On this map from the official history of the Great War, volume covering the Battle of Second Ypres, the British trenches or Allied trenches are marked in kind of red, and the 2nd Essex are part of the 12th Brigade, and where that northern sector, essentially at the sort of left edge of where the red is, the left edge of the British front line. Now, as I've already mentioned, there was very much a putting up. When they move into the trenches, they find there's some, most of it is the bodies of, but they find French troops, French colonial troops, Canadian troops, Indian troops, Gurkhas, where all sorts of different units have been pushed in. And initially, the 2nd Essex were expected to take over a period or a stretch of trench line to allow the troops holding it, troops from the Indian Army, to attack. However, this attack doesn't materialise, and the 2nd Essex find themselves staying in these trenches on a sort of defensive footing. Now, during this period, there was a number of casualties, and as always, we'll just pick some to represent the rest. But one of interest here is Lieutenant Philip Barrell. He was killed on the 1st of May 1915. Now, Philip Barrell is an Essex man. He was born in Essex in 1880, educated locally, and at the age of 19 joins up with his local regiment, but as an enlisted man, as a private soldier. He took part in the fighting in the South African War, a number of campaigns there, and worked his way through the ranks, Lance Corporal to Sergeant, and after 14 years' service, he was actually promoted to a 2nd Lieutenant in February 1915. With this, he was then taken from the 1st Battalion Essex Regiment, where he'd served his time, and posted across to the 2nd Battalion. And he joins the 2nd Battalion, and unfortunately is killed on the 1st of May. Now, Lieutenant Maitland, who we've met a few times before, mainly is the machine gun officer. In his diary, he's talking about this period and mentions Barrell in his writings. So Maitland writes, the Canadian artillery were about as much good as a sick headache. Their guns are worn out and they can't get a shell within 400 yards of the target. Barrell, a fellow promoted into us from the 44th, was killed in the trenches. It is believed by covering fire from the rear. So a couple of notes on this one. One is I don't think Maitland's necessarily having a go at the Canadian artillery. He mentions that their guns are worn out. The reference to the 44th goes back to the older names for British regiments, predating the Cardwell reforms. The 44th Regiment was the 1st Battalion, well, became the 1st Battalion Essex Regiment, and the 2nd Battalion Essex Regiment had previously been the 56th Regiment. The other thing about Burrell is it's interesting, it's like hit by covering fire from the rear, what we'd now call friendly fire, though Burrell's history of the battalion does seem to refer to him being killed by a sniper. The other thing with Burrell is that when he left the 1st Battalion Essex Regiment, he left a brother serving with them who also was killed during the war, and a relative as well was killed with the 10th Battalion of the Essex Regiment. So I mentioned already how there was this puttying up, troops were just being pushed into the line, and we find that the Essex Regiment is holding the front line at the beginning of May, 1st, 2nd, 3rd of May, in this area to the north-northeast of the town of Ypres. And if we return to Lieutenant Noel Irwin, he writes about their movement into the trenches. At nightfall we halted and dug in, under the impression that a screen of troops lay ahead of us, only to find when dawn broke that we ourselves were the foremost troops, and moreover, quite unannounced and therefore unexpected, an attack by an Indian division was about to develop through us. This attack was not pressed home, and on withdrawal of the Indians we took over responsibility of holding the new front. Our position faced north and ran generally along a shallow valley through which flowed a small beak or stream, from which the ground rose on a long gentle slope up to the German position about 1,000 yards away. Towards the right of the battalion sector was the well-known and much fought-for farm called Canadian Farm. At this time I was in command of A Company in support to the front line, which was about 300 yards ahead and 100 yards beyond the beak. So Irwin's in the second line, but in the front line we have Lieutenant Robin Moneypenny. And again, we've met him before, and much of what we take here is from Cameron Farrington's book of Brothers in Arms. Because on the 2nd of May, the Essex Regiment is to find itself in the front lines during another German gas attack. So we'll turn to Robin's writing. Another memorable day dawned on the 2nd of May. At 4 p.m. we were watching the German lines. A huge yellowish cloud of green vapour was suddenly ejected at high pressure, and with a favourable breeze behind, rolled over us. This was the first time we had seen this chlorine cloud. We had had a whiff of it in the previous attack, but it had not been thick enough to be visible and had only made us a bit uncomfortable. The only protection we had was a small square flannel issued to each man, dipped in some ammonia solution, but it was ineffectual. The first instinct of the men was to blaze into it, but this was soon stopped as the cloud reached us. Everyone was coughing and wheezing, fighting for breath. Men began to roll down into the bottom of the trench in agony, the worst place to be as the heavy gas tended to collect there. Suddenly it was too much for some of the men who tried to avoid the gas by climbing out of the trench at the back. Seeing this, I suppose others followed suit. In a way, this was the best thing to do, to get one's head in the upper layers of the gas where it was thinner, but to me it began to look like a panic, and I was afraid of a retreat as some of the men were running away. All I could do was grab the nearest man to me who was leaving the trench. I could not shout or even speak. I was fighting hard for breath, which became shorter and shorter. I noticed the nearest machine gunner doing his best to work his gun. I happened to look over the parapet to see what he was trying to shoot at, and to my horror, across the mist I could see forms approaching. I stumbled to the gunner's aid, but by this time we were both far too gone to use the gun. I felt as if my lungs were bursting, being torn out of my mouth. Everything swam in front of my eyes. I reeled, and then there was merciful oblivion. So the regimental history and the war diary all recalled that the frontline trench was being held by B and D Company, reinforced by one platoon from Irwin's A Company, with the rest of the company being in reserve. And so let's return to Noel Irwin and get his impression of what happened next. Sure enough, on the 2nd of May, as light broke and the German positions gradually became visible, just quick note, Robin Moneypenny says it was 4 p.m. in the afternoon, Regimental War Diary says it's 4 p.m. in the afternoon, but Irwin says it's actually kind of in the morning. The gas rolled onto and over us, a truly terrifying experience, but as far as we could see there was no sign of a following infantry assault. Nevertheless, the gas alone proved too much for many men who panicked and foolishly withdrew with it instead of standing firm and letting it pass over them. Furthermore, the physical effort of running away forced deeper inhalation of the fumes, and undoubtedly casualties were thereby greatly multiplied. Fortunately, my own company stood firm, and I had no difficulty in moving it forward to reoccupy the front trenches, now almost completely abandoned. So if we pause for Irwin's account just now, here's a picture from Deeds That Thrilled the Empire, which is captioned Lieutenant N.M.S. Irwin dashed forward with his men to reoccupy trenches evacuated owing to poison gas. And it's actually for this action, scooping up his company and moving forward to take over the right-hand side of the Essex Regiment's front, that Noel Irwin is awarded a military cross. And these only came in January 1915, so he's certainly amongst some of the first soldiers to get a military cross, and particularly so, he's also amongst some of the first men from the Essex Regiment, officers from the Essex Regiment, to get a military cross. Slight little footnote there, Noel Irwin's son was to serve with the 2nd Battalion Essex Regiment in the Second World War, and during the period of the retreat to Dunkirk, Irwin Jr. was also to be awarded a military cross. Now, where Irwin talks about the soldiers leaving the trenches, and Moneypenny also mentions soldiers leaving the trenches, it should be noted though that some men did stay in the trenches, and it would appear a little group of men from B Company, under Captain Shaw, who we've met before as the Baronet of Paglesham, he and 12 men stayed in the trenches and were able to keep up, as Burroughs describes it. They armed themselves with what rifles they could find and tried to get the machine gun into action, but discovered the team had taken the locks when they evacuated the trench. The names of this gallant party are fortunately preserved but deserve to be remembered. And so, along with Captain Purcell was Company Sergeant Major Tipler, who was unfortunately killed, Company Quartermaster Sergeant Turl, Sergeant Cumbers, Sergeant Baker, Private Brown, Maynard, Howes, Reed, Curtis, Finch, Briggs, and also Private Scrutton, who's noted as being down from A Company. And it's quite likely this is Private Harry Scrutton, who we last met writing to the local newspapers, or writing to friends, and his letter ends up in the local newspapers, about the truce, the Christmas truce between the 2nd Battalion Essex Regiment and the German army, or German soldiers, on the 11th of December 1914. So if we return to Nolwyn, describing this, we arrived just in time to see the enemy infantry emerge from their trenches and start down the long slope towards us. They were too late. They had not closely followed the cover of their own gas, and in consequence we had little difficulty in repelling their attack. They did, however, succeed in advancing their front line some considerable distance towards our flank, particularly opposite Canadian Farm, where under cover of an orchard they approached with 80 to 100 yards. In our reoccupied front line we found one officer and some dozen men. So this is Captain Purcell and Tipler, etc. I find it strange that Irwin doesn't seem to know the name of the officer that he met, because the Regimental History by Burroughs was published before the account by Irwin that I'm reading from you. So maybe there was some sort of lack of respect between the two of them. But we return to Irwin's account. We found one officer and some men who had remained staunch and were little the worse for their ordeal, and, like my own men, felt relatively few ill effects from the gas, which was chlorine. And this is just to show you a map showing the area that they're in, and some of the buildings involved. This is a Google map picture showing the area over which Irwin would have advanced his troops from the support line to the front line. Irwin's got an interesting theory about one of the reasons why he has had less effects. He's already mentioned the fact that they kind of move through the gas. Moneypenny's talked about the value of keeping up off of the ground or out of the trenches, but Irwin has another idea as well. Unreasonable and unlikely as it may seem, and doctors of course say the idea is ridiculous, I've often wondered whether constant smoking throughout the whole period of this attack, and the subsequent one, did not contribute in some strange way to my own complete immunity from any unpleasant consequences of gas poisoning. I distinctly remember smoking continuously on both occasions while waiting for the enemy's assault. Now, we've mentioned that the Essex Regiment managed to keep their line. The Germans have moved closer, and as is always the case with these accounts, units at the side have sometimes given some ground. But with a very small number of soldiers, they have managed to hold the line against this German attack, following up with the gas. One of the men we mentioned was Company Sergeant Major Tipler, Charles Tipler, and he was killed in the attack. And as with many of the soldiers killed in the Ypres area, many of the 2nd Essex soldiers killed in the Ypres area, he has no known burial and is commemorated on the Menin Gate. And it's a bit difficult to see in this image, but quite near the top of this image. And as with many soldiers, he wasn't just commemorated on the battlefield where he fell or on a grave marking where he now lies, but he's also commemorated on a war memorial back in Essex. And this is the war memorial outside the church in Ford End, a small village in the sort of northish of Essex. And you might be able to see there on the side closest to the camera, a couple down, is a Sergeant Major Tippler. Now, we left Robin Moneypenny unconscious in the bottom of one of the trenches, and he continues with his account. It must have been 3 hours before I came to. It was pitch dark, and at first I wondered if I was alive. I looked up and could see the reflection of very lights in the sky. I could hear an occasional shell and the crank of a rifle. But a great lassitude seemed to hold my body. I could scarcely breathe, the breath coming in short, sharp gasps, and with every gasp a stab of pain. I could scarcely move my arms or legs. I must have lain there for another hour, whilst a slight bit of strength seemed to come back, and with some power of coherent thought. The first thing I remembered were those advancing forms through the fog of the gas. What had happened? They must have captured the position. There was scarcely any resistance. In fact, they must have broken right through. Perhaps by now they were in Ypres, perhaps beyond. How long had I lain there? Was it that night or the following night? I must be in German-occupied territory now, so was I a prisoner? I seemed to be in a trench of sorts. Was I still where I fell unconscious? If I could only collect enough strength to get up. Had the Germans used the bayonet and cleaned us up, and had they missed me thinking me already dead? If so, I might still have to undergo that unpleasant operation. There was no trust in them. Presently, I managed to turn over. A very light went up, and I was startled to see the form of a sentry a few yards off. Was it a German? It must be. What was I now to do? Just lie there and hope for the best, or should I make a noise? Would he help me, or would he finish me? Then I heard a voice in a low tone speaking to a German. Was it a German he was speaking? It didn't sound guttural. I strained my ears, and I caught an English word or two. What a relief. I lay exhausted again with the reaction to it. And Moneypenny, in his writings, talks about the reaction of the troops around him when he kind of rises from the dead. Maitland refers to it in his own diaries as well. But there has been quite a cost to the battalion for holding these trenches. At the time, there's not many soldiers left in the front line. But many of those that are marked down as being casualties are actually just evacuated out as wounded and will return to the battalion. And the Burrows has the battalion having suffered 265 casualties, 23 of which were killed, 67 wounded, and 175 missing. And most of those that were deemed to be missing had been gassed, had gone down the evacuation chain, and were admitted to the hospital. So, in their first gas attack, the battalion has sustained great casualties, but it has held the line, and it's something that is going to be repeated over the next few days as the Second Battle of Ypres reaches its crescendo.